we try to look at these issues by doing something called opportunity mapping. So we're trying to look at areas in towns and census tracts and see, you know, if there's access to opportunity in those areas, and then we can map that with other stuff. So we're talking about access to opportunity that can be defined in a lot of different ways, but for our purposes, we're looking at how the schools are doing. So what are test scores? We're looking at educational attainment. We're looking at unemployment rates, the percentage of people on welfare, job growth, whether jobs are accessible in the community, vacancy rates, crime rates, poverty rates, homeownership rates. And we put all of this these data together, and we come up with a map that looks like this. So the darker the orange, the higher the access to opportunity those areas have schools that are performing at a very high level, have low levels of poverty, low levels of crime. The areas that are shaded in very lightly are areas that need our investment. You know, we need to give these places a big hug because they've been disinvested over years and years, and that legacy reaches back to intentional segregating policies and has continued to be disinvested. So we can map this then also with race, and when you put race on top of that, and I'll go back and forth again, you can see that the areas that are most lightly shaded, those low and very low opportunity areas, are where most people of color in the state of Connecticut are living. So I typically don't talk about an achievement gap. I talk about an opportunity gap, because part of what's really different between these types of communities is just the access to opportunity. So when we run the numbers, 73% of Blacks and Latinos are living in those low and very low opportunity areas, compared to only 26% of whites and 36% of Asians. And if you break it out even further and look at just those very low opportunity areas, that's 2% of the land area of the state. It's where half of Blacks and half of Hispanics are living, compared to only 9% of whites. I'm going to zero in here to the Norwalk, Stanford, Darien area, so you can see the segregation is really obvious here, and there's definitely a connection to opportunity. And just because it's not far away, I'm including Bridgeport as well. So this has led to all kinds of things. We have one of the largest achievement gaps in the country. We have some of the greatest disparities in incarceration rates. We have deep health disparities by race. And we have one of the biggest divides in unemployment by race and ethnicity, highest in the nation for Latinos last time I checked. So that's sort of history and impact. And then we also have things that are going on today that we need to sort of grapple with a little bit. We've looked at where the state has invested in affordable housing and subsidized housing, and as Yvonne can testify to, where the state is able to put subsidized housing has a lot to do with the zoning in the towns where it could possibly go. And partly as a result of that, where subsidized housing has gone reflects shows the same patterns that we saw in terms of where families of color are living and where the lower opportunity areas are. So, 87% of subsidized housing in the state is in low, very low, and moderate opportunity areas, meaning only 13% is in those high and very high opportunity areas. And those areas, those high and very high opportunity areas, make up almost 60% of the land area of the state, and it's where 40% of the people live. And just again, to zero in on your part of the state, this is where subsidized housing has been built. In some instances, the subsidized housing, when it does exist in higher opportunity areas, can lean towards being senior housing and not permitting children. It's really important to us to understand what families, low-income families of color, actually want. So we've done a lot of focus groups, we've had a lot of individual conversations, but we've also done surveys of families and found that in our surveys, about 45% of the families are interested in exploring choices outside of high poverty areas.
Oh, that's great, Kylie. Wow, that's just like the real
Oh, I think someone needs to mute their phone, although I'm very happy for Kylie as well.
Is this real?
Yeah, I'm yeah. So
This is
I don't want to miss it because I can't pause it. It's live. Yeah.
So then this is
Oh
and
my gosh, you just
so,
did both of these? They're
Yeah,
great.
and then-
I like his sweater with the heart.
yeah, because he's a kid. And
Kristen, hey Kristen. Oh, there we go.
Oh,
Okay.
I muted her.
Okay, thank you. So the reason that we asked families why, if they were interested in a move like this, why they didn't move. And the number one reason was just because the affordable housing wasn't there. And that was true for 66% of the families who we surveyed. A third of them said transportation was an issue. And as we know, public transportation is a huge issue in the state as a whole, but it isn't the reason most families who want moves like this are not moving. So it's important, but it's not a precursor to doing this work. We asked families why they wanted to make these moves, and the number one reason was they wanted to be safe, and the number two reason was they wanted to get access to high-performing schools for their kids. So this is a chart that has lots of details, and if you're like me, I don't know if you can actually see the bottom of it. I guess you can move that little bar, at least for me, I have to move a bar around to see it. But rather than going through this whole thing, why don't we just compare Bridgeport to Darien, so the top row and the bottom row. So Bridgeport is very low opportunity area, Darien is very high, the poverty rate is 20% in Bridgeport, 3% in Darien. The percentage of affordable housing as defined by the state is 20% in Bridgeport, 3-4% in Darien. The schools in Bridgeport are really struggling and coming in as a 1 to 2 out of 10 on the Great Schools Index. Darien comes in as 10. So, part of what's going on here is there are a lot of myths around affordable housing. There's a lot of fear around affordable housing. And there's a whole lot of ways to dispel those myths, but if I can just do the quickest version, I use this example of Mount Laurel, New Jersey, where they put in, after a long battle, a 140 unit, 100% affordable project development. And just for comparison purposes, Mount Laurel has a median income of about $93,000. So it's lower than Fairfield, Westport, and Darien. And Professor Douglas Massey, who is at Princeton, actually wrote a book about this and really dug into the experience of families. He found that most of the families, as I just recited, had a car, they didn't have difficulty accessing goods and services or their work sites. This next statistic blows me away. The welfare use among the families who moved into the development reduced by 67%. Employment rose by 22%, income increased by 25%. So if you're someone who's worried about dependence on the government, creating moves like this is one of the best things we can do to transform lives, increase mobility, convert someone who might be relying on government assistance into somebody who is actually paying taxes. Professor Massey also looked at whether having this housing in the community was going to decrease home values or increase crime rates and have a negative effect on tax assessments. And what he did is compare Mount Laurel to other towns that were comparable nearby, and he found no statistical differences before and after the housing was built, and even 20 years later. And then he also went around and he looked at the property values. They had not decreased. He also went around and interviewed neighbors and said, oh my God, how do you feel living next to affordable housing? And a typical answer he got was, what affordable housing? So that often happens when affordable housing is built. There's a huge fight at the front end. People get up in arms. And then there are no issues, you know, and I mean particularly affordable housing in really high opportunity areas. Looking at the families who moved in, I think they have a lot of jobs that I think as we're in this era of coronavirus, we recognize even more than ever as being crucial and important jobs: food service, retail, sales, administrative, clerical, healthcare, housekeeping, construction, consumer service, and education, teaching. So we have a whole lot of solutions. Some of them are informed by the work of an economist named Raj Chetty, who is at Harvard. And what he did is he took 10 million tax records, de-identified them, and then these are tax records for low-income families, half of whom stayed in high poverty areas, half of whom moved, and then he tracked the kids in those families for 20 years. And what he found was that for families who moved before the children were age 13, those children had a greater chance of going to college and really high quality colleges. Their income was 30% higher. Girls were 26% less likely to become single parents. And in a companion study involving public housing families moving to high opportunity areas, if that move happened on average when a child was 8, that child's income as an adult, their lifetime earnings would increase by about $302,000. So really meaningful outcomes, and the younger the children were when the move happened, the greater the impact. Does this mean everybody needs to move out of high poverty areas? No, it means as a state, it makes sense for us to enable those moves, but it also makes sense to invest in communities that are creating negative outcomes, because just the community and the neighborhood really matters a lot. The big picture solutions are investing to make sure there are choices and make sure affordable housing is balanced across regions, but then also investing to make sure that struggling communities can equitably revitalize.